podcast is brought to you by Nobel Media. Are you an entrepreneur or maybe a marketer who wants to grow their business through content production? Maybe you're sick of dealing with agencies or want an outsourced solution that actually fits a budget? Well, Nobel Media, our business, can help you with simple and affordable content production, saving you time and money by taking away that pain of producing the content. If you want to learn more, just head to neural.com/media, which is NEURALLE.com/media. Play around with our pricing, have a look at all the different options that you have, request or consider requesting a callback from me personally. If you have a friend that runs a business or is a marketer, do send them our way. It will help us keep the lights on and producing more juicy content. Listeners to this show receive a special discount by using the promo code UNCOMMON. If you want to learn yourself as to how to create content, maybe you want to make a podcast or your very own video, just download our free series on how to create a podcast and video at the very bottom of neural.com/media. Welcome to another episode of Uncommon, the podcast that helps you build your knowledge, skills, and mindset through interviews with unique individuals. My name's Jordan Michaelides, and I'm your host. In this episode, I have for you Daniel Kilov. Daniel is an Australian memory athlete, speaker, writer, and a philosophy PhD student at the Australian National University. He's capable of memorizing a shuffle deck of cards in less than 2 minutes, over 100 random digits in 5 minutes, and placed second at the Australian Memory Championships back in 2011. When I learned about Daniel and his mentor Tansel through the best-selling book Deep Work by Cal Newport, I knew I had to get him on this podcast. The use of memory is probably one of the most fundamental tools we have as humans, aside, of course, from communication through language. Yet we are in an age where handballing a lot of our former memory tasks to our smart devices, forgoing the classic techniques of mnemonics, is becoming all the more common. And as Cal Newport said in his book, the art of memory is incredibly important to becoming a deep worker who can not only increase performance, but also your attention in the process. This was a very insightful episode. There was so much covered in here. Some of my favorite bits included improving memory with ADHD, memory, mindfulness, and philosophy, thought experiments, what the art of memory is, memory and brain health, resources for learning, and how to start applying memory techniques. So there's a lot there. If you enjoyed this episode, do subscribe on your podcast app or consider leaving us a rating. If you want to follow us on Instagram to see episode promos, just go to uncommon_podcasts. Or if you want to see the video, you can search Uncommon Neural on YouTube, which you'll find us pretty easily there. Show notes for all our previous guests and this episode with Daniel are at neural.com/podcasts. That's just NEURALLE.com/podcasts. Thank you guys for listening. I hope you'll enjoy this conversation with Daniel Kilov. Daniel, we're live.
How's it going?
Good, very good. It's windy. I was praying as you were coming over. Not so much praying, but just hoping that it wouldn't get any worse, because what happened, for some weird reason, this building has got like this sort of this fabrication on the side. It's not like a collarbond, but it's like heavier and it's slated. So every time there's enough force and wind, like it gets super, super windy, it'll vibrate. So everything in this room will start to vibrate. And like I'm talking everything in the apartment as well will start to vibrate. And it does my absolute head in.
I mean, I can imagine that would be bad for the podcast, but I'm kind of curious to see that now.
Yeah, and look, I feel like maybe I'm over dramatizing it, but it does feel like this room starts to vibrate a bit. Uh-huh. Now, what's it like being on the watch list for a few different casinos? Is that true, or is that just a joke that you've got in your speaking routine?
Look, I don't know. It may well be true. So I was told this by one of the organisers of one of the Australian Memory Championships. And I know at the very least that betting organisations are aware of memory athletes. because there was one Australian memory championship that I competed in where you could actually bet on the outcome.
Really?
Yeah.
Wow.
So it may well be true, or maybe not. I don't know.
I wonder if they've got, like, it would make sense if you've got sort of like a risk analysis team at a casino, because at the end of the day, that's what they're doing. They're trying to minimize their losses, and they must have like key personalities with photos and everything that they must outline to people.
Oh, for sure.
And they'd be one of some of the first organizations that'd be using machine learning on security cameras. Like, I can imagine at Crown, if you've done anything wrong in a past life or at all, they've probably got that on their database in some way.
And there certainly are memory athletes that have been banned from casinos before. So it's definitely within the realms of possibility.
I found it really interesting. I know you've covered a lot about like your early life and how you got into this sort of stuff. I think the main story was that you're at like most people, you felt that you had an average memory. You were at the library, you found a book. I couldn't find the name of the book, but at the time I think it really blew your mind. You found out who the champion was. Was it written by Tansel?
No. So ironically, the reason you couldn't find what the book was called is because, ironically, I don't remember either. I was working in a library at the time and basically helping update their filing system. So I had to put this radio frequency identification tag in each of the books.
Oh, yeah.
So every book in that library effectively passed between my fingers.
Okay.
And one of them happened to be on memory. And this was before Tansel had written either of his books. And I have a kind of vague memory that it was maybe like a yellow or orange color, but I don't remember who it was by. I don't remember what it was called. Just that it had this this exercise to memorize a list of words. And it's also very generous of you to say that I had an average memory when I was younger. That would have been probably, actually, if I'd had an average memory, I wouldn't have been so impressed with or so primed to discover these techniques. My memory was appalling, like famously bad.
Yeah.
It was a kind of running joke in my family, how bad my memory was. So, when I discovered this book and tried this technique, it was, shocking, because there was this list of words and I memorized them on a single sighting, no revision necessary, no repetition. This is a technique that I'd never seen before, and all of a sudden I could do this incredible thing.
Were you told that you had ADHD or something like that?
Yep. Yeah, I was diagnosed with ADD as a child, and later again as an adult as well.
Really?
So definitely, my abilities to focus and concentrate were on the kind of lower end of the distribution curve.
Now that you're an adult, what do you think about all of that? Because I've got a younger, my cousin's child has, I believe he has ADHD. I've been intrigued by it. Like, is it overdiagnosed? Is it a realistic thing, or is it just sort of like a group of symptoms that doctors aren't able to actually define properly? I was curious as to where you sit on that. Yeah,
so I will start my answer by saying that I'm not an expert in this at all. I think that, though, I mean, that being said, not being an expert on things has never stopped me from having an opinion about them. And whilst I'm certainly open to being shown to be wrong, I think that it almost is it's almost certainly overdiagnosed.
Okay.
And I think that it's very often used, the diagnosis is used as a method, and the diagnostic criteria are used as a method of controlling kids. So if you have a look at the diagnostic criteria for adults for ADD and ADHD, they're things like, struggles to attend to the things that they care about, misses out on things that are important, deadlines that are important to them, that sort of thing, right? Now, if you have a look at the diagnostic criteria for kids, they're things like doesn't pay attention to their parents or teachers, right? Misplaces the homework they're supposed to do. Now, there's a big difference between these diagnostic criteria. In the adult case, what they highlight is that the adults are struggling to do things that they care about.
Okay.
That's a genuine problem, right? If I really want to be able to do something and I can't, because my mind is kind of working against me in the relevant respect, that's really problematic.
Mm.
But if a child isn't listening to their teachers or isn't doing their homework, that's really not obviously, it's not obviously the case that the child is struggling to self-regulate. What it indicates is that the child is not being regulated by the parents and the teachers. Right? And so, I'd be much more comfortable with a diagnosis if it were concerned primarily with, the kid's capacity to regulate their own behaviors in accordance with or in relation to things that they really care about. Right? So a kid that struggles to focus on a video game that they're really interested in beating the next level, right? That's a sign, that kid's really struggling to focus. But the fact that I didn't do what my teachers told me to do probably indicated at least as much that the things that my teachers were telling me to do weren't very interesting.
And do you, just on the point of not being able to do something you want to do as an adult, does that mean like you're so, mentally you're ruminating so much, or you just literally cannot focus? Like, how does that work? Is it that you just you have such a lack of conscientiousness that you can't get anything done?
I think so. I think that the attention deficit is something of a misnomer in the sense that we're always paying attention to something, right? So if someone's daydreaming, or if they're lost in a daydream, then they're paying a great deal of attention to that daydream, right? So it's more of an issue with attentional regulation. It's not that they lack this capacity, or they're not paying attention to anything at all. It's that they're unable to direct and maintain attention to towards a particular task. Yeah, does that answer the question?
Yeah, that makes sense. I'm curious then as to how if you could measure it over the years, how has it changed the fundamental wiring do you believe in your brain around attention?
Yeah, so, there are two things to talk about. One is the brain, and then the second is the thing we actually care about, which is my ability to pay attention.
Okay.
So, my capacity to pay attention has increased enormously. And it's not just my ability to kind of sustain attention in relation to particular tasks, but also I've developed a kind of metacognitive ability of being aware of what my attentional states are. So let me give a simple example to illustrate what I mean.
Yeah.
I'm sure you've had this experience, and I'm sure all your listeners have had this experience of like reading a book and then getting to the bottom of the page and realizing only once you're at the bottom of the page that you've kind of zoned out, right? Yeah. So the problem here is not just a kind of lack of attention, but also a lack of awareness of what your attentional states are doing, right? And so we need to cultivate, if we want to improve our memory, and attention is an important part of this, mindfulness is an important part of this, then it's important not just to cultivate that faculty of attention, but also to cultivate this kind of metacognitive faculty of being aware of our attentional states.
Yeah, and this reminds me of some of the techniques that come into play as a memory athlete. But I want to jump to Ted Cook, because I know you met him in London, I believe.
That's right, yeah.
Yeah. See, I've just, for me personally, in the last, say 6 months, I've learned that I've had really bad health anxiety. So I had these food intolerances. I believed that the symptoms I had were related to the food intolerances, but as it turns out, what happens for some people, at least 50% of people that have these food intolerances, they become hyper, interoceptive. Like they just become so obsessed with things internally that it makes everything a whole lot worse. It's got all sorts of names like visceral hypersensitivity for this area of health or food intolerances. And so what I learned is that over the last 6 months, more and more and more, it's like I've gone further and further back. It's like for a while I had like these, like if you go to like a Grand Canyon and if you've got these lenses that are really zoomed in, and over time it's come way, way back. And this idea of interoception versus exteroception, I guess, is that the two terms I'm looking for, is what Ted Cook and a lot of other masters of memory have spoken about, which sort of lends to the idea of mindfulness. So I'm curious as to how important you believe this idea of mindfulness is to this area.
Yeah, look, I think it is fundamental, essential. So there are kind of like 3 fundamental principles that I normally talk about in pretty much all of my talks and so on. And mindfulness is the first of them. And because the thing is, it doesn't matter how many times we see something or are exposed to something. If we aren't paying attention to it in the first instance, we aren't going to remember. Mm-hmm. So, as I say, you have to train that kind of attentional capacity. And then, as you say, what you want to be able to do as well is learn to modulate that, because having kind of too narrow a focus or too narrow attention or getting like too stuck on something can also be kind of just as disruptive or just as problematic as, having a kind of attentional state that's sort of too diffuse.
Mm. Do you practice in any way mindfulness? Like there's the obvious mindfulness in your everyday life, but, are you meditating regularly or anything like that?
Yeah. So I have been meditating for quite a long time now. So in 2011, I did an academic exchange program at the Central University of Tibetan Studies in India.
Oh, wow.
And studied Buddhist philosophy and encountered meditation for the first time then. And then I kind of became increasingly interested in the kind of cognitive science of mindfulness that was sort of really taking off back then. I've since then spent some time living in a Buddhist nunnery in the Himalayas where I was teaching English, did some meditation there. I've been on a couple of retreats. So I've done quite a lot. I mean, I also have a daily Ashtanga yoga practice as well. So I do about 2 hours of yoga every morning.
Wow.
But in addition to that, the memory techniques that I practice, and I'm sure we'll get into this, are part of a kind of 2,500-year-old tradition of mental training in the West, known as the art of memory. And the kind of key writers and thinkers about these techniques, memory techniques, all talk about the importance of attention, and all have their own kind of methods for attentional training as well. Uh-huh. And so, although I guess I've spent most time studying the meditative techniques of the Buddhist tradition, in particular the Tibetan tradition, and I teach Buddhist philosophy at the ANU, I nonetheless think that there's also a kind of rich tradition of mindfulness that has been part of the art of memory right back to its origins. So, I use these techniques, I guess, the mindfulness meditation techniques just in virtue of my own kind of history. Yeah. But this is not something we're importing into the art of memory. This is something that's always been there right since the start.
Uh-huh. And more so that as time has progressed, people in the West have become more aware of how to become better at being mindful through processes like meditation.
Yeah. And look, I think it's wonderful because most of this, as I say, mindfulness stuff has come about or been imported from the Tibetan tradition, but there have been contemplative traditions in the West as well. It's just that, we lost sight of them for a little while.
Yeah. There's so many ways we could go here. I could start with the art of memory, the philosophy, and maybe want to just jump back to Tansel, who was basically the champion, I guess, in Australia when you reached out to him.
Yep.
I don't know if he still is. I didn't have time.
He's not anymore.
He's not anymore. I know he was in 2011, right?
Yeah. So he's basically, he's not really competing anymore. So he's kind of shifted gears from focusing on his own sort of memory scores and competitions. He still trains, but he's now, I guess, he's taken a more of a kind of organizational role. So he's now organizing the competitions and stuff like that.
Okay, right.
And kind of, giving back to the community in that way.
What were the first few years like learning from him?
When you say first few years, I didn't really train with him for all that long.
Really?
So I contacted him with really a very simple email. I asked him effectively 2 questions. Is it true that anyone can learn to do this? And if it is, can you teach me? And he replied in the affirmative to both. So I think I only trained with him for really a handful of weeks, and really like once a week for a few hours each day. But before entering the first memory championships that I entered.
And it was by 2011 you placed second, right?
That's right, yeah. So I think it was...
Just behind him.
Yeah, that's it. And I set a national record as well.
Okay. Because that was one of the things you've mentioned in a few interviews and talks, is that you don't really actively train now like you would have when you first started off. And that's sort of the intention of the process. It's once you refine it. You have things like the meditation we were speaking about, but generally once you learn the principles, they're there.
Yeah, I mean, there are two things to say about this. The first is that the kind of return on investment for the techniques is enormous, right? So if you want to learn how to play something like piano or pick up, guitar or something, it can take weeks, maybe months before you can play anything more sophisticated than chopsticks, right? It really takes a lot of effort to get to a reasonable level. Not so with the memory techniques. So one of the kind of amazing things about these techniques is just how quickly you can develop really effective, functional, useful skills. So that's the first thing. And then, yeah, as you say, like unless I'm preparing for a competition, I don't need to practice all that much because real life sort of provides all the opportunities to use these techniques and practice these techniques that I could want. If the techniques really are as kind of practical and as useful and effective as I say they are, then one shouldn't really need kind of forced arbitrary drills to practice them. Just use them,
Yeah, it just becomes a part of your life.
That's it.
Yeah. It's like it's like anything. When you learn a new thing, you start seeing it everywhere. But in this case, because they're so powerful in everyday application, you just continue to reinforce and use it.
Exactly.
Where did the philosophy thing has interested me because obviously you did your arts degree, and then it seems like in your postgrad years you're sort of moving towards philosophy. I've always, like as a kid growing up in a Greek family, I was told the stories of Odysseus, which then leads into things like learning about Greek philosophers. And one of the more interesting books I've read is The Cave, or The Parable of the Cave. Why go in this direction? Like, you see so many people I don't know if you know Jim Kwik. Jim Kwik is he used to be like a memory athlete in the US, and now he's got Jim Kwik's program for learning memory, and he's got this massive Instagram profile and all that sort of stuff. Why not go down that direction or start like a memorize like Ted Cook? Why go down the philosophy direction?
Well, I don't necessarily see them as kind of incompatible, but also I think, okay, so there are two questions here. The first is why philosophy, and then the second is, why not memory? So I'll start with the first. So, I was always interested in philosophy. So when I did my arts degree, I majored in philosophy and I minored in bioethics, which was really just an excuse to do more philosophy. So I did kind of as much philosophy as I could, and basically because it just seemed to me that I couldn't do anything else until I'd answered some of these fundamental foundational questions, right? Like, it's very hard to know kind of whether or not something is valuable unless you can say in virtue of what things are valuable or what it is for something to be valuable. And that's kind of always been the case, that I've always been very interested in sort of very foundational questions. And philosophy is, the discipline that deals with those most foundational of questions.
And what area of first principles are you most interested in?
So I actually work currently in the philosophy of philosophy. So what happened is I kind of got to philosophy hoping to get all the answers I wanted to these sort of foundational things so that I could get back to sort of thinking about the sort of first order issues. And then what I discovered is that, there is very substantial disagreement about in philosophy. And a lot of this disagreement hinges on what you think the right methods are for getting at the answers to philosophical questions.
Okay.
And so, yeah.
So there would even be questions as to whether there is one method.
Yeah, absolutely. And there almost certainly isn't a method of philosophy. I mean, I think one of the things that one of the things that distinguishes philosophy from other disciplines is precisely that we don't have an agreed upon method or set of methods for answering the particular questions that we do. And in fact, on some philosophers' views, once you have a sufficiently clear idea of how to go about answering questions in a particular domain, it stops being philosophy.
In what way is there scientific method within philosophy? You know, like if things are so questionable, how do we, you know, like in a hard science like physics, things are very provable. Like you have proofs through mathematics and so forth. So where does that line stop, or where does it end? Where does it? I don't, you know, like I'm very intrigued by that.
Yeah, I mean, how long have you got?
We got all the time.
So, you know, experiment is a very, very powerful way of getting at how the world is. But of course, it's not the only legitimate means of intellectual inquiry, right? So, I mean, there are lots of sciences even that don't really use experiments in the traditional sense. You know, if you're a paleontologist digging dinosaurs up from the ground, you know, you're not doing double-blind placebo-controlled trials on those, right? So,
yeah.
And similarly, you know, mathematicians don't do experiments. They do deductive proofs, right? Same with logicians. But this is, of course, still a wholly fruitful way of coming to know how the world is. So the first thing to note is that there's a great diversity, even in the sciences, in terms of the methods that are used. And so saying, you know, what it is actually about science or scientific method that makes it special is one of the most famous problems in the philosophy of science. This is what's called the demarcation problem. You know, how do you differentiate a science from, say, a pseudoscience, for example, or even a science from other intellectual exercises like, say, history or literature or something like that?
Yeah.
Now, yeah, as I say, I think things are even more complicated and even messier when it comes to philosophy. But, you know, my own view is that philosophers should be effectively omnivorous in the sources of evidence that they're willing to draw from and the sources of methods that they're willing to use. So for myself, my thesis is an example of what's sometimes called experimental philosophy.
Okay.
So I use not just kind of careful conceptual analysis, careful attention to, you know, language and concepts, and careful attention to logic, but also I'll employ methods from experimental linguistics and semantics, experimental semantics, also experimental methods from the social sciences and psychology, really whatever kind of tools or methods that I can use to try and get a handle on some of these difficult problems of philosophy.
What's your thesis on?
My thesis is on expertise, and in particular, philosophical expertise.
Okay.
So there are a whole lot of so-called experts in various fields that research has revealed are not experts in surprising ways. So to give one of my favorite examples, which you may be familiar with, there's a psychologist in the United States, a guy named Philip Tetlock, who wanted to basically investigate how good so-called political experts were at making political predictions.
Mm-hmm. I think I know this one.
Okay.
Yeah.
So for anyone who doesn't, I'll just explain very quickly what he did. So he had basically a bunch of political experts. So people who made a living from making political predictions, including political scientists from Ivy League universities, you know, professional politicians working in the White House, political journalists and political pundits on TV, people who, as I say, you know, kind of their job was to make political predictions. And he had them make thousands of predictions over a number of years. And at the end of it, what he discovered was that they were no better at making political predictions than the average reader of the New York Times, and barely better than a chimpanzee throwing darts, and significantly worse than very simple algorithms that just extrapolated from present circumstances and followed rules like things will keep going in the direction they're going, or things will stay the same.
And it makes a lot of sense, because politics is like the convergence of business, media, marketing, and a bit of bullshit sprinkled over the top. So it's like, as George Carlin would have said, it's you know, that perfect segmentation of everything that is bullshit. And it makes a lot of sense, because a lot of those pundits are basically pushing a message in some way based on the team that they support.
Yeah, exactly right. And but nonetheless, this is surprising, right, in the sense that when we listen to the predictions of these experts, we take them to have some special authority or expertise on the matter. But whatever expertise they have, at the very least, doesn't mediate or improve their ability to make political predictions. So, basically, I guess close to 2 decades ago now, some philosophers. So the way that much of philosophy has traditionally gone on, at least in the kind of analytic tradition, but of course, preceding that as well, has been through the use of thought experiments.
Yes.
So if you're familiar with like the trolley problem or anything like that. So
well, the cave that I was talking about is a good thought experiment.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
So these do go back all the way to the origins of philosophy, but it really is, some philosophers have even written that it's the kind of standard justificatory procedure of analytic philosophy, contemporary analytic philosophy. So, but, and basically the way that these things work is philosophers imagine a scenario and then they sort of check what their intuitions are about this scenario. Intuitively, should we pull the lever or, and divert the trolley or should we not?
Yeah.
And basically some philosophers in the US thought, well, hang on a minute. If intuitions constitute evidence for philosophical theories, then what we should do is just go out and conduct surveys, conduct polls, and gather people's intuitions. And when they did this, what they discovered was that there was systematic differences in intuitions along sociocultural and economic lines, right? So people from different cultural backgrounds and different socioeconomic backgrounds. Now, this...
Different cognitive biases. It makes total sense.
And also just kind of different perspectives. Well, so it's, it's not, we shouldn't, I suppose, speculate too much about what causes these differences. But, I think this wouldn't have been surprising to, say, any first-year anthropology student. Nonetheless, it was something of a kind of cat among the pigeons for philosophers, because a hallmark of any good method is that, you can kind of replicate the results, right? It doesn't matter if you do a physics experiment, it doesn't matter whether you do it in Australia or Japan, you'll get the same result. And so some people have kind of taken this to be a challenge to the, as I say, standard methods of analytic philosophy. Now, some people have effectively responded to this by saying, look, we shouldn't be worried about systematic variation. It doesn't undermine what we do. And the reason it doesn't is because you would expect systematic variation. So suppose, that you went and got the diagnostic judgments of a bunch of professional doctors. Mm-hmm. And then you went and got the diagnostic judgments of a bunch of lay people.
Okay.
Now, philosophers, I might use the term, so I'll explain it here. Philosophers often refer to non-philosophers as the folk. So the term philosophers often used for lay people is the folk. So if I refer to the folk, you'll know what I mean.
Okay.
So
that's too good.
Now, crucially as well, many philosophers in many traditions also consider themselves members of the folk in relevant respects, and we can come to that later on, but that does turn out to be important. But basically, we should expect, so the diagnostic judgments of the folk will be systematically different from those of trained medical professionals, and you'd want that to be the case, right? You should really worry if it's not, because the folk don't know anything about making diagnostic judgments. So if the doctors aren't any better or aren't any different, then what that suggests is there's no real contribution from their medical expertise to their judgments. So basically what these philosophers have said is, look, the variation in responses is to be explained by philosophical expertise. The reason that philosophers' judgments vary systematically from those of the folk are because philosophers are experts and the folk are not.
Okay.
Now, this is... to my mind, an interesting suggestion, but that's all it is. It's a kind of hypothesis. And crucially, it's a hypothesis that can be, I think, empirically tested. And so the question my thesis asks is this: are philosophers more like, say, surgeons or genuine experts, or are they more like, political scientists, these kind of fake experts? And how could we tell? So, one big problem with this is that, if you have a bunch of medical people it's not that hard to test whether or not they're medical experts. You just give them a kind of quiz because you know what the right answers are and you see how many right answers they get. How do you evaluate the expertise of individuals in a field where nobody agrees on what the right answers are?
That's so hard.
Yeah, that's the challenge. Now there are I think clever ways to do this, and I'm kind of flattering myself here because this is what my thesis is about, but I can't talk about them because if I do, then it might. If anyone out there listens to these and then wants to participate in one of my experiments, then
they might
bias the results. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm learning more and more as I see you talk why you went into this area. Like you seem to have a natural intrigue in something. And it seems like you would dive right into it, like with the memory, that you would dive right into it as your sort of, I don't know, your world perspective changed based on that new area or topic. And I've always had that, except my problem is I'm like a sort of magpie that sees lots of little things and I'll jump from thing to thing to thing. So I guess that makes me wonder, is memory still something that you think you'll pursue over the long term and as a sort of sub-specialization? And how would it help what you're doing now?
Well, I mean, as it happens, I think that, there is a very close relationship. So for a long time, I really didn't think there was much of a relationship between what I was doing in philosophy and then the stuff that I was interested in memory. More recently, my view has changed, and I've come to see lines of convergence between these two things. It's now quite clear, I think, that memory is the kind of it's the essence of expertise and the essence of genius and human creativity, and so there is in fact a very close relationship between the kind of research that I'm doing now and my interest in memory. To answer your original question, though, without a doubt, I will spend the rest of my life, I think, doing memory-related stuff. I think that the kinds of things that I'm interested in doing in this space are different to some of the stuff that's out there. So, memory athletes talk a lot about the relationship between memory and creativity. But we are, I think, as a bunch, fairly uncreative, at least in terms of the books that we write. Unfortunately, almost every book on memory techniques is exactly the same and all bad in the same ways. That is to say that they tend to focus on very simple examples. So I think some people sometimes, when they first encounter memory techniques, and they sometimes come away with this impression that these things are useful, they're kind of like good party tricks, or kind of useful for a very small range of things like memorizing lists, that sort of thing, but not really suitable for any kind of real practical or heavy-duty sort of abstract learning.
Right.
And I think this is where a little bit more academic rigor can be an appropriate curative to this. So one of the reasons that I'm very interested in the history of these techniques, and one of the reasons I'm interested in the history of these techniques is because when you have a look at the history, what you discover very, very quickly is that these techniques were developed for use in very, very practical, but also very, very high level and very abstract educational contexts. Mm-hmm. So during the Middle Ages, for instance, these memory techniques were one of the principal methods by which monks would learn and meditate on religious texts, but also they were used really as kind of tools of composition. Thomas Aquinas supposedly composed his entire Summa Theologica, his sort of greatest work, entirely in his head. And he would dictate, he would have 6 scribes. He hated writing things down famously, and he would have 6 scribes in front of him, and he would start dictating one chapter to one. And then while he was waiting for them to finish sort of writing down whatever they were writing, he would turn to the next scribe and start dictating a completely independent chapter.
Wow.
And and we have records of kind of Julius Caesar having done similar things. So these techniques were also, heavily influenced, thinkers like Giordano Bruno, who was one of the first people to propose a sort of heliocentric model of the solar system. Also Gottfried Leibniz, who was the inventor of calculus alongside Newton, and also a very great, very, very great philosopher and scientist. So, these techniques were used by thinkers for very difficult learning tasks, very, very complex, sophisticated material. There's another book which I recommend called The Memory Code by a woman named, a Melbourne-based researcher actually, named Lynn Kelly.
Okay.
And she talks about, she has this wonderful, it's a great book, there's heaps and heaps in it, but there's some wonderful ethnography basically about various indigenous cultures throughout the world and how they've used various mnemonic techniques to help transmit knowledge that was effectively essential to their survival. Right, so this is very practical, practical really in the kind of truest sense, where if you would get this wrong, you would just die. There's a very high premium on accurate transmission of useful knowledge. So she talks, for example, about the Indigenous Australian songlines and the kind of picture she paints, well, at least the way that I understand it, is, that they would kind of use the landscape as kind of, giant memory palaces, which is, memory palace is one of the kind of...
Yeah, one of the techniques.
Yeah, and they would transmit at kind of key locations, various bits and pieces of information through song and dance and all these other things that we know are kind of powerful mnemonic devices. And so, yeah, it's a curative to this idea that these techniques are not that practical, to look at the broader historical use of these techniques. So, I think that I definitely have a contribution that I want to make in the memory world. There are a whole lot of really interesting discussions and really interesting things to say, and things, crucially, that I feel haven't been said by other memory athletes.
And so maybe we could get into what it is that the art of memory is. Like the way that I've come to understand it now, it's sort of a loosely grouped, loosely grouped principles, I guess you could call it. I think one of the things you referenced on your site was, I don't know if I'm pronouncing this right, mnemonics?
Yeah.
Mnemonic techniques, whatever it is. And it combines things like mindfulness, encoding, and then organization as well.
Yeah. So this line about a loosely, what is it that you said? A loosely organized.
Loosely organized.
Yeah, or loosely related, whatever. I think that comes from the Wikipedia page on the art of memory, and I don't really like that. So I actually think that they are quite unified, these techniques.
Okay.
That there is a set of principles that, there is diversity. There's fairly significant diversity, particularly historically. When we're talking about a 2,500-year-old tradition, right? Of course, there's going to be variation and diversity. But there is always, at the very least, a kind of, family resemblances story that we can tell, where there is both a kind of historical thread that travels through all of these various traditions that are called the art of memory. But I think more than that, they are united by certain commitments to certain principles. So, certainly attention is one of them. And part of these are just kind of physiological constraints placed on us by the kinds of creatures we are and the kinds of brains we have, right? That is to say that there is no human in the world that can remember something that that hasn't come into their awareness.
Yeah.
Right. And so you cannot have a tradition of memory training or something that's part of the art of memory that does not have as a central part of it this emphasis on awareness and mindfulness and so on, and attention.
And so if you were to describe to the audience listening, what are some of the key exercises, the things that they could start considering to apply in their life today?
Yeah, so there are three things that you mentioned, this mindfulness, visual encoding and organization. And I'll talk, I suppose, very quickly about each of these because I think that's a really good place to start.
Yeah.
Because as I say, I think these are the principles or concepts that animate all of the techniques of the art of memory. Now, there are some notable historical examples, where they've kind of tried to jettison the visualization aspect, but still, these other two were very strong there, and whatever. There's, it's a major part of the tradition anyway. So, starting with mindfulness, it might seem, I think, so obvious as to not be worth mentioning, but most failures of memory are actually failures of attention.
Okay.
So to give a very simple example, on the Australian $1 coin, which way does the Queen's head face, to the left or to the right?
I believe it's to the right.
How confident are you?
Not very.
Okay.
Yeah.
So I've asked audiences of over 1,000 people this question, and many, many audiences. In fact, I ask it in almost every talk I give.
Yeah.
And I pretty much always get a 50-50 split, which indicates, of course, that everyone is guessing.
Yeah.
Now, she does face to the right. But
I wouldn't know now because so much of, I don't really use cash. I haven't used cash regularly for about 5 years.
Uh-huh.
I've got a jar on my desk over there, and it's got all sorts of coins in it, which I probably pick up only to go print things at the library.
Uh-huh.
Which goes to your point, you have to be attentive to that thing, right?
Yeah, I mean, look, even if you haven't, and it's true, none of us are using coins as often, as maybe we were, 10 years ago or whatever.
Yeah.
But still, this is an image that we have encountered hundreds, maybe thousands of times. And crucially, she doesn't just face to the right on the dollar coin, she faces to the right on all Australian coins, right? So all of us have seen this image innumerable times. But the point is just that we never really cared. So to paraphrase the inimitable Sherlock Holmes, all of us see, but very few of us observe. And it's the observing that makes all of the difference. So one of the first skills that we need to cultivate if we want to improve our memories is learning not just to pay attention, but also learning what it feels like to be paying attention so that we can become better at recognizing when we're not.
Yeah.
That's this kind of metacognitive ability that I was talking about earlier.
And this goes to the point of being extraceptive. Is that the word? Or extroceptive?
Well, I think both.
Being aware of things outside of you. And why I was referencing health anxiety is because I reckon so many of us in this day, driven by things like social media, the use of smartphones, become very internal, so to speak, and less and less we notice, not even noticing how this logo looks or the Queen's on the right side of a coin. Yeah,
so I think that's right, but notice that you have to cultivate good introspective abilities as well. That is to say that, in the case of anxiety, this is a kind of a sort of malfunction of the attentional system in a certain sense, in that you are essentially victim to the ruminations, right? It's it's an inability to stop focusing on that particular thing. So, and certainly, from the perspective of being a memory athlete, the introspection is really a big part of what we have to cultivate, and certainly for kind of most practical learning as well. Introspection in the sense of paying attention at the very least to how well we're paying attention to other things, right? So even if we're cultivating awareness of the outside world, we still need to be cultivating awareness of our awareness of the outside world.
Yeah. And that's sort of what I was getting to, is just being aware of that fact.
Yeah.
How do you do that? Or how do you recommend people do that? Is it simply having the conversation with yourself and emphasizing it on a weekly basis through a diary, or how do you how do you make that regular?
Yeah.
Outside of I just forgot about it and now I'm going to remember it.
So I think that there are a couple of things that can be really, really helpful. One is a particular meditative practice called shamatha.
Mm-hmm.
So
how do you spell that?
SHAMATHA. ATHA, something like that.
Okay.
So I recommend a book called The Attention Revolution by Alan Wallace. Now, shamatha is it's a meditative technique from the Buddhist tradition, but it is effectively, it predates the Buddhist tradition. It's effectively a secular technique and focuses predominantly on, so as opposed to sort of vipassana meditation, which is where most of the mindfulness stuff that people encounter today comes from, that's a kind of a method for introspecting and reflecting on the nature of experience. So a kind of nice metaphor is to think of shamatha rather than, if you think of your mind as kind of like the sky, shamatha is less about looking up at the sky, and it's more about building a better telescope that you can then aim wherever you want.
Yeah.
Right. And that's the kind of traditional purpose. So it's normally done as a kind of supportive method to support more kind of inquiry-based meditation practices like vipassana. That being said, the skills that one attains through shamatha, the skills of attentional control, can then be directed towards any object. It doesn't have to be other meditative practices, right?
Okay.
So that's kind of one of the main meditation practices that I have.
Yeah.
So that's and it's a really, really good place to start. And in particular, I think starting with the breath, but it could be any object of meditation. It doesn't matter. You could use a statue or a candle or a stick or whatever.
Yeah.
So I think that starting to cultivate those attentional capacities that way is really, really good in a kind of formal sitting practice. But crucially, we need to be able to bridge the gap between the formal practice and then everyday life. And I think that this is a big challenge for lots of memory athletes too. There are lots of memory athletes out there who are really great at memorizing decks of cards or memorizing binary digits, but are unable then to take their skills out of that competition environment and start applying them in the real world. And so, what's really important, again, with the meditation, it's great to have a formal mindfulness practice, right? Whether that's yoga or, a sitting meditation or whatever. You need to be able to then take that out into the real world and use it when you're, and employ those attentional capacities that you've been honing when you're reading or studying or...
And that's the hardest part. I believe
it's all hard.
Yeah. Well, it's just hard to really translate it into actual practice.
Yeah, and I think because it's I think that the reason it's hard is because there aren't good resources, or there aren't that many resources with good ideas on how to do that, right? And again, this is one of the criticisms I have of the memory books that are out there, is that they have all of these very simple examples, and the reason that they all recycle the same examples is because it means they don't have to come up with any new ones, and coming up with new ones would be hard. And so, if the resources were there, I don't think it would be all that hard, right? I can offer some very simple suggestions, for how we can go about bridging that gap, and we can talk about that. But basically, someone has to kind of develop these methods and put them into print.
And so we've spoken about attention. The other component you mentioned before was, so is the next layer down visualization?
Yeah.
And this is this idea of mnemonics, right?
Well, a mnemonic is anything that, basically anything that helps you remember something, right? So the word mnemonic comes from Mnemosyne, the Greek goddess of memory. And a mnemonic could be anything like the very sophisticated techniques that memory athletes use, but the term also applies to, the kind of acronyms you might have learned in high school or something like that.
Okay.
The visualization effectively just takes advantage of the fact that there are certain kinds of information that we all remember more or less effortlessly. So, for example, if you closed your eyes now, you could mentally navigate your own home, no worries. And you could probably do it in quite a high degree of detail as well. And probably as well for like homes you grew up in, maybe for homes of friends or family, places you've only been a couple of times. And what's really remarkable, there are kind of two things that are remarkable about this. The first is the volume of information, right? That you're able to recall in this way. Like you can probably remember, like, not just where your bookshelf is, but if there are any kind of particular knickknacks on the bookshelf, or what some of the things that might be on your desk or something like that. So the first thing that's remarkable is the volume. The second thing is the effortlessness with which you learnt this information. You never made any deliberate effort to learn any of this stuff. You didn't have to do any revision, any repetition. You just kind of know it. And so the kind of trick then, the sort of secret sauce of the art of memory, is to transform the kind of stuff with which we struggle, whether that's kind of names or faces or course notes or decks of cards in the case of competition, into the kind of thing that is effortlessly memorable in the same way that the location, the layout of your home is.
And a lot of that, it seems, based on the interviews you've done, the things that I've read over the years, is around the story. And this is sort of going back to the point we were chatting before we started even recording this, that people often practice things like mnemonics by habit, and that's why they're good at memory, but they don't even realize that they're doing so. So a lot of my memories are often based on a visual story. I always tie something to a situation or a story around that situation. And it seems like the techniques that you were using to train people on these shows or these talks was around making, let's say, the story around buying this cup of tea so outrageous and silly that you couldn't not forget it.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And this is just taking advantage of what psychologists sometimes call among other things, what psychologists call the Van Restorff effect, which is just the observation that, we are more likely to remember things that stick out like a sore thumb. And so the more kind of funny, engaging, interesting, surprising we can make our mnemonic images and our mnemonic stories, the more memorable they're likely to be.
So my grandma's had dementia for about 3 and a bit years. She recently passed away in the last few weeks, and I was curious about because you've written an article in the past, I think it was about how the use of memory can improve potential long-term brain health, or not so much brain health, but why it's important for someone who is aging, so to speak. Where do you currently sit on that?
Yeah. Okay. So got to be careful about how we talk about these things here, in the sense that one thing I wouldn't want to do is to give the impression that that training in memory techniques is going to help delay age-related cognitive decline or Alzheimer's or dementia. Thank you very much. Unfortunately, I don't think we have any good real preventative measures. So, I know that organizations like Alzheimer's Australia and so on recommend things like dancing and doing crosswords and stuff, but the evidence really isn't there that these things make that much of a difference. So I certainly wouldn't want to claim that, memory techniques can basically prevent age-related cognitive decline. And in general, there doesn't seem to be any real evidence. So if long-term training in memory techniques changes the brain structurally, we certainly don't know how, or have any real evidence of that. So there was a study done by a team of researchers from University College London, the same ones that were the same team that was responsible for the now famous finding about the London cabbies in the enlarged hippocampus.
Yeah.
So this same team basically wanted to look at the brains of elite memorizers to see whether or not there were kind of structural differences in their brains, and if there were, whether those structural differences could account for the superior memorizing ability of the memory athletes. And so to test this, they took a bunch of memory athletes and a bunch of controls, just regular the folk, and put them in an MRI machine whilst they had them memorize, I think, names and faces, random digits, and configurations of snowflakes. But they actually didn't find any differences any structural differences in the brains of the memory athletes versus those of the controls.
Really?
Yep. Not only that, but the memory athletes scored within normal ranges on every test of cognitive ability. So there were differences in the patterns of brain activation, right? So the memory athletes had significantly more activity in the region of the brain, well, in the hippocampus, But that's just in virtue of the fact that they were using these memory techniques. Now, this is important because, we now know, I think, that, for a while, these kind of brain training games were really popular. There was like the Nintendo Brain Age and Lumosity and stuff. And there have been a number of really big systematic reviews showing that these things are effectively
marketing.
Yeah, it's bullshit.
Yeah.
And so I really, really wouldn't want to give the impression that, and I think we should be very careful not to talk about memory training as brain training. What we're doing is we're developing a particular set of skills. And we don't really need to be all that concerned with what's going on inside the brain because, well, who cares? At the end of the day, what you want to know is, can you memorize more, right? And so, so I don't want to give the impression that that this might, change the brain or constitute some kind of brain training, or that it might be, effective for delaying the onset of age-related cognitive decline or illnesses like Alzheimer's or dementia. That being said, I think that these techniques could potentially be useful forms of therapy for people with these conditions.
How so?
Well, that is to say that even as natural memory declines, there is still benefit to be found in using these sorts of memory techniques. Now, of course...
So it may delay the onset, potentially?
No. Rather, it may mitigate some of the cognitive deficit that arises as a result of the diseases.
Right, okay.
Because the memory techniques work in a different way to our natural memories, our normal... sort of normal memory processes.
Yeah, so maybe an example would be if you're an elderly individual and you're starting to lose your memory through, say, vascular dementia, which is basically like you have a mini stroke and the blockage is in your hippocampus is what I've learned, basically. And that starts to impair your memory in different ways for different things. So instead of worrying about the fact that you're losing that memory, you can potentially utilize those techniques to, alleviate things when you are forgetful.
Yeah, so of course we have to go on a case-by-case basis, right? So there are going to be certain conditions where these memory techniques are going to be really, really helpful. There are going to be other conditions where the regions of the brain affected are precisely those that would be required for the memory techniques to be used, right?
I'm just choking on my water. Yeah, that makes sense.
So but there is, so what we need is more research, firstly, but there is also already some research out there on the use of these techniques in a therapeutic context. The other thing is, I think that, so when we're talking about for, overcoming deficit or as a kind of potential therapeutic intervention for diseases, as I say, we can't make any global claims, but there certainly are going to be cases where these techniques could potentially be very, very helpful. I think also that they can bring real peace of mind when it comes to sort of just natural aging, in the sense that, the sort of natural cognitive decline and stuff to do with memory that comes with aging, in that although it becomes, sort of harder for us to remember things, we can improve our abilities using these techniques. And there certainly doesn't seem to be a point at which the techniques sort of, can't be learnt or whatever,
You were you were a guest on the Feed forum a while ago, and they had a platform around smart drugs. I couldn't actually view the episode at all, which was really frustrating because I wanted to see... I don't know what it was, like it was a failure with the player or something like that, but I wanted to see what you spoke about on that forum. But generally, I guess I'm curious as to where you sit with smart drugs. Are they really smart, or are they another form of marketing?
Yeah. Okay. So there are really kind of two questions. The topic of the discussion on the Feed forum was concerned really the sort of ethics around the use of these substances. And certain kind of philosophical issues. And I was very fortunate actually to share the stage, so to speak, with a philosopher, Nicole Vincent, who actually was one of my teachers during my honours thesis at Macquarie. Yeah, and she really is an expert in this sort of thing, though we happen to disagree, I think, on this particular issue. So, I am, in general, for the use of smart drugs. That is to say that I think that any substance or any intervention, that's going to help people achieve their goals is going to be good. The fact that there might be certain health risks associated or whatever, that's largely going to be up to the individual to think about what they value. So we might think about this, in a kind of uncontroversial case. Let's take something like diet, right? There are different diets out there, and different diets are going to be, there's no best diet. There are only kind of best diets indexed to particular goals. So for example, if your aim is to live for as long as you can, it looks like a kind of caloric restricted diet with, or some kind of intermittent fasting is going to be really beneficial. If, on the other hand, you're an elite athlete trying to kind of put on, like, let's say you want to be an Olympic weightlifter, skipping meals probably isn't such a good idea. You probably want a kind of, really high protein diet that's going to be much higher in calories, right? So if your aim is athletic performance for that particular sport, then the optimal diet's going to look quite different. Now, it seems crazy here that we should feel comfortable legislating, as to kind of like what the right diet is or what diets are not okay, because let's say they carry certain risks. Similarly, kind of elite training regimes in different sports have corresponding and often high levels of risk associated. But we recognize that people should be free to do those, to pursue the particular goals that they have. Now, there doesn't seem to be any reason to adopt a special attitude towards smart drugs, all else being equal, right? So, of course, there are kind of issues about equality of access and so on. But a lot of those issues are the same sorts of issues that come up in these other things, So not everyone has access to the super highest level sports training things or whatever. Not everyone has access to kind of equal opportunities in terms of education and so on. And we should do everything we can as well to kind of reduce this sort of inequality. But the issues surrounding smart drugs aren't, in my view, special issues. They don't present fundamentally new kinds of moral dilemmas. So if there are particular interventions that, including smart drugs, that help people achieve their particular goals, then I think that they should, all else being equal, have access to them.
Yeah.
The problem is that our current smart drugs are not very good. Things like Ritalin and modafinil, these things, certainly can improve focus and they can certainly be very helpful for some people. But, they don't really improve learning all that much. They don't really improve any kind of cognitive abilities, in terms of they're not going to really help you perform significantly better on like tests of IQ, for example. And it's not clear as well that they really improve academic outcomes, which is the thing we actually care about, right?
Yeah, because modafinil is one of those ones that people talk about regularly. I've been surprised when friends or people I know, acquaintances, will talk about having taken modafinil regularly.
Yeah, look, it's very, very common, and it's very common amongst, I think, graduate students. These sorts of smart drugs, stimulants, are very commonly used. Again, there's a psychologist on the feed forum on that episode who from, I think, University of Canberra, who researches this stuff. But yeah, it's not that uncommon. The big problem, as I say, is that I think that the benefits from these substances are significantly less than the kinds of benefits you would get from other kinds of lifestyle interventions like regular cardiovascular exercise, good sleep, and a good diet.
Healthy diet.
And so, whilst I don't have a problem in principle with smart drugs, and as I say, I think that people should have access to them where they're going to be helpful, at the very least, our current smart drugs are really not all that impressive.
Yeah.
I think. And then they do carry costs, So with all of these stimulants, they can negatively impact sleep. They can, increase, anxiety in people that are prone to anxiety, and so on. So they're not a free lunch in any sense of the word.
Definitely not.
And there are some studies as well that show that they can impair memory in certain ways. So whilst they increase your ability to pay attention. There are certain kinds of learning tasks that they're probably not particularly good for.
When it comes to one thing I haven't actually asked you about your career as a memory athlete. You know, you were, you probably still are capable of memorizing a shuffled deck of cards, which you've done many times on many different shows. I think I mentioned before you were second place 2011 at the Australian Memory Championships. What is it what makes one a memory athlete?
Yeah, so I think, strictly speaking, all that it takes to be a memory athlete is just to compete in a memory competition. But I don't think that's quite the question you're asking. I think you're asking, what does it take? What do I do when I'm preparing for a competition? So I also competed in 2012 and also more recently in 2016. So, and basically, it's the reason I think that athlete is an appropriate term and not, say, stretching the term a little bit too far is really because of the kind of preparation that goes into it, and the fact that in both cases, in both the case of being a physical athlete and being a memory athlete, you don't get to kind of take time off, right? So when you're a professional athlete, you might, let's say you train from 9 till 5 or whatever. Then you go home. It's not like you've finished work and then you can sit back and eat a whole cheesecake or something. That's going to affect your training. That's going to affect your results. And so the same thing is true when you're a memory athlete. You can't just do the training while you're at work and then come home and do things that are going to undermine that and undermine that progress. So, when I'm preparing for a memory competition, I'm certainly training for the events, and I'm training in the same kind of deliberate way that physical athletes train. I'm drilling, I'm drilling particular techniques, working on improving certain methods. Also, that kind of mental side of the game of staying calm, of learning to, I guess, modulate levels of arousal as well. So sometimes you want to be kind of switched on and you want to go and you want to be able to move really, really, quickly. Sometimes if there's a little bit too much adrenaline, you've got to dial it back a bit. All of the same sorts of skills that are useful in the context of physical sports are useful again in the context of mental sports. So I'm much more disciplined, say, about my sleep, about my diet, about everything, particularly when I'm preparing for competition. Although, I think that's a lifestyle that I maintain even beyond that.
Okay. And what's the funniest or quirkiest thing you've had experience during a competition? What's the most outrageous? Because there's some pretty weird stuff that gets done for competitions.
Yeah, look, it's this kind of weird thing in the sense that the memory competitions are probably the most boring spectator sport in the whole world, in the sense that if you walked into a memory competition, it's a lot like walking into a university exam. It's like people in sort of stunned, slightly terrified silence staring at pages of, meaningless stuff. With furrowed brows and so on. But that's kind of contrasted against what's going on internally, right? Because whilst what's in front of me is say a page of binary digits or something, literally the most boring thing you can imagine, right? The kind of thing that if you were to look at a sheet of digits, let's say, 20 rows of 40 digits or whatever, it's unlikely that you would even bother paying enough attention to differentiate particular numbers, right? It's all a kind of amorphous, terrifying mass.
Yeah, it's just a bit of goop on paper.
Exactly, yeah. Whereas, as a memory athlete, what we do is we kind of transform that into this very kind of interesting and unusual and quirky and weird sort of story. We kind of jump into that, formless goop, and that's a kind of playground in which we can generate these insane stories. And so there's this juxtaposition between what's going on the outside, which is the most boring possible thing, and then what's going on the inside of memory athletes' minds, which is, these incredible, colorful, quirky, amazing, creative, interesting stories. If there were a way to, peer inside the minds of memory athletes, it would without a doubt be the most exciting and interesting sport ever, bar none.
Yeah. Yeah, I can imagine that. It's one of those very internal sports that you wouldn't like unless you're really into it, and unless you've participated and you viewed it before, then it would be amazing to you, like mind-blowing stuff.
Yeah.
I'm realizing we're running short of time. I need to jump into some short, fast questions. But one thing we didn't actually cover earlier before we took the break was so we covered the three elements of this memory technique. So we went through attention, visualization. What was the other element?
Organization. Yeah. And I can give a kind of very nice short answer to this question, but effectively, the way to think about organization is it's how we organize information when we first learn it that dictates our capacity to recall it later on.
Mm-hmm.
And the kind of key practical insight here is that association is the language of memory.
Okay.
Right? So if I'm trying to memorize a deck of cards, what we do is all memory athletes, we have a kind of memory palace, this like path this sort of mental landscape we travel through. And then we kind of lay down images. We associate with particular locations, images that represent whatever it is we're trying to recall. And then recalling that information is just a matter of walking back through that landscape and seeing what we left there.
And is that landscape typically somewhere that exists in real life and where you imagine something overlaid, or is it an artificial place that you've created?
So typically they're real places.
Okay.
But there certainly have been examples, both historically and in contemporary memory competition, of people having fictional memory palaces. Almost all of my memory palaces are real locations, though sometimes I'll kind of, add on an extra room or something like that.
Okay. Yeah, because I've always wondered, that idea of the memory palace was really, like, if you like Sherlock Holmes, if people have watched it, there's a scene where they visualize his memory palace, because he talks about that a lot in the actual books. And yeah, it was the way that they articulated it was very interesting.
Well, I don't think actually in the books he uses memory palaces at all.
Really?
Yeah. So he talks about, in one of the early stories, he talks about his attic analogy, but that's the closest he gets. And in fact, the impression that he gives there is that so Sherlock is proud of his ignorance of both matters of politics and also the fact that the Earth revolves around the sun. He doesn't know this. And the reason he doesn't know this is because he has a kind of trained ignorance about these things, because he worries that if he learns things that are relevant to fighting crime, that it'll crowd out certain other pieces of information.
Of course.
Now, of course, this isn't how memory works. And in fact, in later stories, he actually appears to, in fact, be aware that the sun rotates around that the Earth rotates around the sun, because he deduces certain facts about his location and so on. Well,
that actually points to that point you had about volume. Do you think that there's a capital
in terms of
memory?
So there must be, in the sense that the brain is a finite physical system, right? So it's just a kind of truism that there is some limit, but I don't think that we are anywhere near that any human ever has come anywhere near filling up their brains. And indeed, Sherlock seems to have been totally wrong about this, in the sense that the more we know, the easier it is for us to learn new things. So, and this is, I think, a fairly, although this is kind of, as I say, supported by a lot of wonderful cognitive science, this is a fairly, I think, pedestrian observation, in the sense that, if I pick up a paper on academic philosophy, I'm going to be able to get through that paper faster and get more from it and put it in context and associate it with other relevant things and generate more interesting hypotheses, in virtue of the fact that I have been doing a PhD in philosophy, than someone who has no background or familiarity with the field.
Yeah, and you've got the building blocks there. And so they're all arranged in the spots, and so you might take a tenth of what's in that, and that will be valuable to you. Whereas someone else may use the entire thing, and it may be valuable, or it may not at all, because they don't have the context.
Yeah, exactly, because there's nothing for it to kind of stick to, right?
Yeah.
And so when we're experts in a particular field or area, it's easier for us to accumulate information in that area. And so the more we know, the more we can learn. And in this sense, this seems to be the exact opposite of what Sherlock was talking about. Though, as you say, in the in the Benedict Cumberbatch show, he uses the Memory Palace to great effect and in a very exciting way.
It's a very good scene.
Yeah.
If you were recommending resources, if someone was to start reading a book, applying these 3 core principles, where would you suggest they start?
As in to learn more about memory techniques?
Yeah.
Yeah. So, I mean, this is particularly hard given that I've just spent the last little while trashing most of the memory books that are out there. But there are some exceptions to what I've been saying. I mean, the most notable one is Moonwalking with Einstein.
Yeah.
Joshua Foer's book. And
that's right.
Which anyone who hasn't read that yet should go out and do so. It's a really, really wonderful book. It's the kind of book that, you'll finish reading and then almost certainly want to pick up and read again. When I first read it, I started getting into memory right before this book came out. And I was sort of a little bit angry when the book came out because I was like, this is exactly the book that I would have liked to have written in 5 years' time or something like that. He does such a marvelous job. It's a great read. There's not that much in there in terms of, explicit instruction in the techniques, but, it's a wonderful exploration of memory in general, and I think would equip anyone who read it with an appreciation and understanding that would definitely inform and improve their application of memory techniques if they would go on to read some book about memory techniques afterwards.
Mm. All right, we're going to jump into some short, fast questions. What does your morning routine look like?
So mostly I kind of roll out of bed at about 6:30 and run to yoga. It's like a 10-12 minute run away from my apartment. I'll do my Ashtanga practice, which takes generally around an hour and a half, and then I'll run home. Then I'll kind of start the day. I've been experimenting lately with the Wim Hof Method and cold showers and stuff, which has been fun, but I must admit I'm not particularly good at doing that consistently.
Okay.
I normally sit down. I have a fairly leisurely morning, actually. So I'll do a little bit of reading. I'll do some meditation stuff. I normally sit down to start my kind of deep work, as Cal would put it, by about 10.
Okay.
And then I'll work from about 10 until 6 with some. I'll stop for some point at lunch.
Okay.
But sometimes I'll work through lunch, or just skip lunch entirely if I'm really onto something exciting.
Right.
And then, actually, this is advice that I got from the book. I now have a fixed schedule workday, so I stop at 6 o'clock.
Yeah, it's been very hard for me to do that, but I'm slowly getting there.
It's made an enormous difference to my productivity.
Really?
In two ways. The first is it prevents one from just burning out and feeling exhausted all the time. And the other is that if you don't have a fixed endpoint, and as a graduate student, this is particularly hard because you don't, then, you have this sense that you have all the time in the world to get everything done.
Yeah.
But if you know that you have to stop at 6, then you're going to be much more deliberate about planning your time. This is going well past my morning routine, but then depending on the day, I'll either go to kind of like talks or seminars or whatever on campus. Sometimes they're in the evenings. I mean, normally they'll finish around 6, so I'll go to those. It means I'll stop my deep work earlier because I don't normally think of talks and stuff, important as they are to my profession. I don't normally think of them as deep work in quite the same way. And then I like to go to the gym and do a little bit of running, on the treadmill, and maybe some strength stuff. And particularly something I've been really enjoying for the last, say, 6 months or so is sauna. Using a sauna has made a big difference to my routine.
Yeah.
There's some
dry or wet?
Wet.
Okay.
So there's some really interesting stuff out there on hypothermic conditioning, and it's a lovely way to cap off the day as well, to kind of like just relax and chill out.
It's very good.
Yeah.
Yeah. I the dry sauna I don't like. It I don't know why, it just dries me out way too much. I feel like I'm in a desert. whereas the wet sauna I feel like I can at least deal with. It's a lot of fun though.
It is. It took me also quite a while. I mean, I read when I sort of originally started reading some of these studies, the temperatures they talk about are really high, like 80 degrees, for example. And it's surprisingly hard to endure, or when I first started, it was surprisingly hard to endure a sauna at that temperature for more than, just a few minutes.
Really?
But like everything, it's amazing how quickly you sort of condition and... and so that's really been a real kind of game changer as well, in the sense that I've always struggled to wind down and switch off. Like getting up for yoga was not something that was easy for me or that was natural. I'm not a morning person at all.
Right.
And given if there's no kind of pressures on me, I feel much more comfortable sleeping from like 2 till 10 than. And I think that's one of the reasons that I still start work so late, is just because my kind of body clock doesn't really wake up until about that time anyway.
And how do you decompress apart from the sauna at night? Do you read or do you watch TV or? Yeah,
I mean, so I'm trying to, for the same reason, sort of reduce screen time. I really like video games. And
what's your game of choice at the moment?
At the moment, I'm playing through The Witcher 3.
Okay.
And it's really fun. And it's something which, so this is another really important reason to have a fixed schedule workday. If you don't have a fixed schedule workday, if you feel like you should be working, then anytime you play games or do anything else, it's just procrastination, right? Uh-huh. Because it's a distraction from the thing that you feel like you ought to be doing. And the real cost of procrastination is the way in which it robs you of your ability to enjoy the present moment, right? Because at the back of your mind, you've always got that voice that's being like, you should be working.
Yeah, should be doing this, yeah.
Yeah. And so...
That's interesting.
I really made a deliberate effort to schedule leisure time, and in particular to schedule time for video games, because the only way that I could really enjoy them properly was if I was deliberate about setting aside times and just like taking leisure time seriously.
How long did it take you to get to the point where you were properly stopping at 6 every day? Not long?
Oh, look, I think it took me so I'm into now the 6th year of my PhD. I think it took me the first 3 or 4 years just to realize how important that was.
Right.
In the sense that I was working, I didn't have a fixed work day, and I was also working over weekends as well.
But like to implement it, because I find that implementing it is hard. Like there's such a battle mentally to not stop for me.
Yeah. So as I say, I think by the time it actually clicked for me, I was just so ready, in the sense that I had really been kind of like, I'd gotten to the point where I was just burnt out from being a graduate. Because again, as a graduate student, you have no one telling you when to start, no one telling you when to stop. You have no real deadlines. You just have one big thing, and it's ever present, And so, as I say, I think it took me, 3 or 4 years just to kind of realize the cost of not doing that. And once I understood the cost, once I understood that I was kind of burned out, that I was losing enthusiasm, that I never had a moment that I could really enjoy myself when I did have leisure time. It always felt like procrastination. Then I had this really strong incentive to change. And I don't get it 100%, every day.
Of course, yeah.
It's probably only like 70% of the time. But, so I have certain habits that I track every day. So things like exercise, meditation, my gratitude journal, my yoga, doing some form of mental training. So at the moment I'm preparing for the world's Rubik's Cube Speed Solving Championships.
No shit.
It's going to be in Melbourne in a few months, yeah.
Okay.
And so at the moment I'm tracking that as well. And, again, kind of making the decision to track, because, I mean, I'm sure this is no news to any listeners of your podcast, but it's just the old Drucker quote, right? That if it's not measured, it's not managed.
Yeah.
And so once I started tracking that was also really helpful. In fact, I actually started tracking it before I really resolved to do it, because there's pretty good evidence out there that just tracking something will tend to mean that people... So, for example, if you have people weigh themselves every day, they will tend to lose weight. Even if they make no other deliberate thing, but it's just a way of like forcing that mindfulness.
And when you're tracking it, will you have a specific diary, or will you just write out each day or each week ahead, or how does it work?
So I've just got some iPhone app. It's very lightweight. It's called like Daily Habits or something like that. And it's just like a little circle that I just press, and I get feedback, on the frequency and the streak and all those nice little things. But it's a very, very lightweight app. I've tried other kind of more complicated things like Habitica and stuff.
Because at the moment I just have like a spreadsheet. And it's just my week to week within time blocks, and I just fill it in. And I've tried, what I used to do is I would get really irritated if something wasn't checked off or scrubbed out. But now I've sort of just started circling the things that aren't done as a way of sort of, I don't know how to explain it, but like sort of reinforcing to myself that, sometimes it's okay to not get everything done, and that you can come back to that next week. You don't have to cross it off.
Yeah.
And it's really hard.
Yeah. And look, I think that this is something that's really important as well. So, I have always felt a little bit uncomfortable with some of these apps, in the sense that you really don't want it to be the case that, you feel that you sort of punish yourself if you don't get something done.
Yeah.
Or that like you sort of get a rush from that you do something just to tick it off. So there's a really rich body of research showing the ways in which the various and also quite surprising ways in which extrinsic motivators, both punishments and rewards, can be totally corrosive to intrinsic motivation. And so I think a lot of these kind of these efforts to gamify habits and stuff like that can actually be quite counterproductive, because for a couple of reasons. And again, most of them, these are well supported by research, but most of them are pretty intuitive. So, if you get rewarded for completing a task, then you will just tend to do whatever it takes to complete the task. And if the easiest way to complete the task is to cheat, you will just cheat, because it's about completing the task. It's not about the task itself, right? And so, you'll kind of cut corners. You'll do whatever you can to get the reward, because the emphasis is on the reward and not on the activity itself. And this is true, in kind of school contexts with giving out grades and so on. It's true, in all kinds of different contexts, basically. Also, let's say there's something that you previously did because it was like enjoyable, or you recognized it was important or something like that. If you get paid to do that thing, you will stop doing it if you stop getting paid. So let's say, let's say you have a kid and you ask the kid to take out the trash, right? And let's say you offer to pay them 50 cents to take out the trash. They will never again take out the trash unless you pay them 50 cents. Yeah. And not only that, over time, they'll start to demand a raise.
Yeah. Right? I always say this, you can't just give people something and then take it away.
Yeah. And basically the thing is that a better thing to do, a better alternative, is to help the child understand the importance of taking out the trash. Help them understand that this is an intrinsically valuable activity. Mm-hmm. There's a wonderful book called Punished by Rewards by Alfie Kohn, which is a good summary of a lot of this research. Another one is Dan Pink's Drive, The Surprising Science of Motivation, I think is the subtitle. Right. But basically, I'm always skeptical of efforts to gamify habits and stuff like that, because any kind of extrinsic motivators, including rewards, can be, as I say, corrosive to genuine motivation.
Okay. If you had to gift one book to the audience for Christmas, let's say, what would it be?
I mean, I love books, and I read a great deal, obviously. In fact, I have the privilege of reading for a living. Look, I think it'd probably be Moonwalking with Einstein.
Okay.
Because it is just a wonderful exploration, not just of the world of memory sports, but of memory in general. And it situates memory quite appropriately as the kind of, the seat of human identity, as the kind of laboratory where the alchemy of human creativity takes place. It is the kind of king of cognition in this sense, and he does a wonderful job of exploring that in many, many different ways. So the book talks about the science of memory, it talks about the science of expertise and skill and the relationship of that to memory, it talks about the history of memory, the memory competitions. It's a wonderful. He creates this beautiful cohesive tapestry by weaving together what seem like very, very disparate threads. And so it's a wonderful read. I'd recommend that to everyone.
Yeah, it's one of those books I've not read but heard many, many times. And so I think I'm definitely going to be putting it on my Amazon list.
Great.
Last question for you. If you could have a billboard anywhere in Australia, where would it be? And then what would it say?
Oh God. It's a hard one. So I guess I would want it wherever the most people would see it.
Yeah.
Wherever that would happen to be. I don't know where that is.
I think a lot of people say like King's Cross in Sydney, or there's the silos on Punt Road, or somewhere on Punt Road is what people often say. But yeah, probably one of those two spots.
Yeah. Okay. Cool. Either of those then would be fine. I'm happy to defer to you on this. And as for what it would say, I mean, I would have to think of an appropriately pithy way of putting this, but what I would want to communicate is the idea that, memories are not like files on a computer that we just pull up when we need. Rather our memories, the things that we know, the things that we have stored in memory, constantly enliven and shape our perception of the world. And the richness of our experience is limited by how much we, by how much we know about it. So can I give a little bit of an example? I know we're finishing up, but
yeah. Are
you familiar with the poem "The Learned Astronomer" by Walt Whitman? Okay.
Walt Whitman I know pretty well, but I've not heard of that poem.
Okay, so it's I'll leave it to your readers to look up, but to the listeners rather. But basically, in the poem, there's a student, the protagonist of the poem, who's listening to this learned astronomer, basically, watching as he writes these sort of facts and figures and so on about the heavens on the board, and unaccountably becomes ill, and so rises from his seat and then walks out into the night sky and looks up at the stars and, is kind of, I guess, soothed by the incredible and raw beauty of the sky. And the point is supposed to be something like this, that, the facts and figures and diagrams are a poor substitute or pale in comparison to the majesty of the night sky. Now, due respect to Whitman, he's totally wrong about this. Did you want to read the poem out?
How about you read it? There you go.
Oh, okay. All right. When I heard the learned astronomer, when the proofs, the figures were ranged in columns before me, when I was shown the charts and diagrams to add, divide, and measure them, when I, sitting, heard the astronomer where he lectured, with much applause in the lecture room, how soon, unaccountable, I became tired and sick, till rising and gliding out, I wandered off by myself, in the mystical, moist night air, and from time to time, looked up in perfect silence at the stars. Now, it's a beautiful poem, but he's wrong in this sense. That in the sense that the facts and figures and stuff detract from the experience of the sky. So it's true that, were you and I to go out in the night sky and, assuming we were sufficiently far from the light pollution of the city and look up, we would have this incredible, beautiful experience, right? And something that borders on, kind of spiritual. But were an astronomer to do the same thing, she would have no less of that experience. But in addition to that experience, she would have, in virtue of her learning, a sense of the incalculable distances of space, of the hottest possible heats of the furnaces of stars and the coldest possible colds of the vacuum of space. She would have, in addition, a narrative spelt out across the stars in the various kind of configurations of the sort of mythical figures in the constellations and so on. So,
that reminds me so much of what Feynman says as well. And I wonder if it was in response to that poem.
Okay.
Yeah.
Cool. Well, I'm in very good company then, if that's true. So, and Feynman is right on this as he is on so many other things, in that, the richness of our experience is basically determined by how much we know, by how much we have stored in our memories. And the influence of those memories is not passive. It's a constant active thing. Memory, as I say, imbues our experience with meaning. So I'll give one really quick example of how this works. So I think this is in 1946. We might have to look this up. There was a Dutch psychologist named Adrian de Groot who...
I think I know. I think that's right, yeah.
Who wanted to determine the source of skill of high-level chess players.
Okay.
And so to do this, he gave a group of chess players... he showed a group of chess players of various levels of skill, configurations of various real, although unfamiliar chess games, and then had them reconstruct the boards from memory. And what he found was that the chess experts were able to reconstruct the boards almost perfectly. By contrast, the novices could only recall the configurations of pieces about a third of the time. And the reason for this is that the chess experts literally saw the boards differently. For them, the configurations of pieces all held meaning. They were significant. They were tied into narratives about past games. They could recognize a particular move as, or configuration as resulting from a move that was maybe invented in like ancient India or whatever. Or, they recognized it for its sort of tactical and strategic significance. And so they didn't just see pieces on a board as you or I might, but they saw things like units of meaning, parts of greater kind of stories, and the shape of the tactical terrain on the board. Whereas you or I, in virtue of knowing considerably less about chess, most of that would just be invisible to us.
Yeah.
And so the kind of source of skill of high-level chess players, and we didn't really talk that much about the relationship between genius and memory, but the source of skill of these high-level chess players was what they knew about the game. And we know that because their kind of superior memories were limited to those particular domains of expertise. So whilst chess experts have really great memories for chessboards, they don't have great memories for kind of music. So it's not that they have some kind of general intellectual ability, general high IQ, that they sort of is the reason that they're chess geniuses. It's the other way around. Their superior memory is the product of their knowledge of chess, not that their superior memory is what produces their expertise.
Yeah.
And so this kind of traditional narrative of genius as being the result of kind of innate talent or an innate ability to learn things really, really fast, it gets the relationship between memory and expertise and genius backwards.
Yeah, I would 100% agree with that. I think genius is often... it's got to be peppered with... There's the obvious thing, you've got to have talent. You've got to have an above average IQ.
So I'm going to disagree with you there, and I'm going to offer two pieces of evidence.
But the point that I was going to make is you must have a good memory. You must, but also that you must be able to apply either of those things with some form of conscientiousness.
Yeah, so I'm going to I guess offer a kind of counterpoint to the talent claim, because I think that this is misleading.
Well, I put IQ under talent.
Yeah. So would I.
Yeah.
So if you look at the highest levels of chess, IQ has no ability to predict whether or not someone's going to be an elite chess player. None at all. It drops completely out of the picture. If you look at, say, national level chess championships, the kids with the highest, and particularly if they're kind of younger kids, the kids with the highest IQ will tend to be the ones who win. Now, the reason for this is basically that whilst IQ does increase the ability at which you can acquire skills and so on, at a certain level of expertise, what mediates expert performance is the development of new representational structures and new cognitive that facilitate new cognitive abilities that kind of didn't exist previously. And once you start using those things, this is the product of your kind of 10,000 hours of deliberate practice. Once you start utilizing those, IQ drops out of the picture completely. Completely.
Wow. If
you look at the average IQ of a Nobel Prize winner, the average IQ of a Nobel Prize winner is only 130. Now, that's something like the top 98th percentile. Now, it is not true that 1 in 50 people is doing Nobel Prize winning work, right? 130 that's the average, that's the IQ of an average graduate student.
Right.
It's not that high. And the difference, the distance it is from the average, is probably better accounted for by various social facts. Like the fact that kids that are identified as having slightly higher IQs are given kind of more opportunities, more educational opportunities, which means that they tend to outperform their peers. Anyway, but it's in virtue of those kind of additional opportunities. So, it's like Malcolm Gladwell has this wonderful bit at the start of Outliers where he talks about how the vast majority of hockey players are born in a very small part of the year. And the reason is that by the time they come to tryouts, those kids are a little bit older. And so they just outperform just in virtue of like the normal developmental trajectory, right?
That's right, yeah.
Now, the same thing happens in an academic environment. So kids that are slightly older or maybe have slightly higher IQs or whatever tend to get streamed very early on. So those kids get taken, when they're, let's say, 8 years old, they get put in a kind of extension program where there's far fewer of them. They get way more attention from the teacher and they're pushed much harder.
Well, yeah, we've interviewed like Olympic swimmers, and it's that fact they're basically in a machine.
Yeah,
that's wanting to push out swimmers, Olympic swimmers.
Yeah, and so what happens is the difference between them and their peers is even greater the next year over. This is what sociologists call the Matthew effect, right? The rich get richer. And so this difference in IQ is probably better accounted for by social facts like that than by anything to do with the importance of IQ. Now, the reason that psychologists have for so long felt that talent was some kind of important thing, or IQ is important, is really because of like two things. Firstly, IQ is a very good predictor of academic performance and life success and so on in general. In fact, it's the single best predictor other than the socioeconomic status of your parents. It's a better predictor even than conscientiousness and things like grit.
Right.
IQ is one of the most well-studied psychological constructs that we have. We've got so much data on this.
Yeah.
And then the other thing is that when psychologists have tended to study skill, they've tended to study it with simple tasks in laboratory contexts. And, so they'll use a task like finding particular words or something, making particular shapes, something simple like that. And in these contexts, people that have a higher IQ will tend to learn the tasks faster. And so what's tended to happen is that these researchers have just tended to assume that what they see in these simple laboratory tasks, that at the highest ends of the skill distribution, you're just extrapolating out from that, right? But this is just a kind of methodological artifact in that sense. And when you go and study experts in the field, world-class performers, whether it's musicians, whether it's athletes, whether it's mathematicians or scientists, whatever, chess players, IQ drops out of the picture completely. In fact, anything that could plausibly be considered talent drops out of the picture completely. The determining thing, as I say, are these kind of representational structures, basically how much they know, how much they have stored in memory. And so, this kind of offers this, this is just the 10,000 hour rule. This is not anything, sort of new in that sense. But it does raise an interesting question. Memory athletes seem to be able to learn hundreds of times, thousands of times faster than the general population. So could the techniques of memory athletes be used to bend the 10,000 hour rule?
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, it's a good question.
Well, I think the answer is yes.
Well, yeah, it seems the obvious answer.
Yeah, and so I think that what you get from, as I say, this is one of the reasons that the history of these techniques is so interesting. You get this kind of convergence of lines of evidence from cognitive science, from anthropology, from history of the art of memory, from the, stuff on the memory athletes. You get this convergence, and what you have is the kind of the prefigurings of this vision of an education system where we could produce, entire generations of Darwins and Einsteins and Picassos and Gandhis and so on.
If this was applied.
Yeah. And that's, that's something that I think is worth exploring further, and something which, you asked before about whether and how I intend to continue with the memory stuff. And that's certainly something that I think needs to be explored.
And you've thought about it deeply. Well, I'd agree. And I think that was one of the reasons why I wanted to get you in here. I think as I've taken an interest in this sort of stuff, like I only just read Deep Work, and as I said, you were in there, I reached out to you, and this whole field of memory has become quite fascinating to me. So yeah, I think for anyone listening, they should definitely have a look at some of your talks. Where do you think where's the best place for people to find you? Is it somewhere on social media or the website or?
Yeah, so just my name, danielkilov.com, or if you search me on Facebook. I mean, I don't spend a huge amount of time, on social media stuff.
Probably a good thing.
Yeah, again, I'm busy working, but certainly, I'm more than happy to answer questions that people have about this stuff, and I do private coaching as well for people that really want to learn this stuff deeply and get into it.
Okay.
So yeah, my website's probably the best point of contact.
Yeah, there's a lot of good information on there as well, particularly the videos. I liked watching all those.
Cool.
Daniel, thank you so much for coming in. This has probably been one of the longer episodes we've ever had, so you should be proud.
Great.
There's
Thank
a lot
you very
there,
much.
and I've still haven't covered a whole bunch of stuff, but maybe next time you're down in Melbourne, we can wrangle you back in.
Yeah, absolutely.
All right. Thanks, mate.
Thank you.
Thank you for making it to the end. Before you run off, we need your help to grow this audience. Subscribe on your podcast app. Subscribing will give you priority access and help your fellow-minded listeners find Uncommon, or consider sharing this with a friend who you think would enjoy these sorts of episodes, and this will go a very, very long way in helping us build the audience. Don't forget to like us on Facebook and Twitter, or consider subscribing on YouTube as well. You just need to search for Neurale, Neurale, or consider following us on Instagram as well by searching Uncommon, UNCOMMON. But until next time, thank you so much for listening.